All right, I am told we are live. Good evening, everybody. My name is Nick Smith, and I am pleased to serve as First Deputy Public Advocate in the office of our city's Public Advocate, Gimani Williams. This is the second in a really amazing series of our civic engagement series, discussing in a nonpartisan way what is coming up early November, which is Election Day. We know that when we go to the polls, we'll be required to vote on different offices, but there's a couple of questions on the ballot, which are proposals for amending the state constitution. So we're happy to have a great discussion this evening about the questions on the ballot, and for tonight, particularly about redistricting, with a couple of really amazing panelists. But before we go into the panelists, I want to do two things. First, I will thank our partners and our interpreters, and then I will yield to a video by our city's public advocate, Gimani Williams. Thanks to our partners, including the NAACP, Conference of Metropolitan Council of Branches, NCNW, I see Manhattan, Flatbush, and the Staten Island chapters. I see from CLSJ, Laurie Daniel Favors. I see the Black Women's Political Club. Thanks also to the Capital Area Urban League. Thanks to Nan Youth Huddle. Thanks to one of our panelists comes from here, the APA Voices. Jennifer Wilson of the League of Women Voters. We Act. And finally, Generation Vote and the OCA New York chapter. We also want to thank our ASL interpreters, Jody Prysock and Teresa Lott. And I, speaking of interpretation, should describe myself before we go further. I am a Black male with a blue shirt sitting in front of a brown background with a couple of plants in the background. And with that quick introduction to tonight's discussion, let's hear from our city's public advocate, Gimani Williams.
Peace and blessings, everyone. This is Gimani Williams, your public advocate. And I want to thank you for joining our office this evening for teaching to share critical information about the ballot referendums New Yorkers will see when they walk into the voting booth in just about 2 weeks. Tonight, we're talking primarily about proposal number 1, which includes reforms to our election administration as well as to redistricting. These are problems that we come up against again and again, that we talk about again and again, but that too often we don't meaningfully address. Now, we have a chance to share our voices and our votes on this issue. There's a lot of information to go through, but we have experts, the people doing the work on the ground, joining us tonight to go through it. Thank you to all of the partners who have worked with us on tonight's event, on this initiative, and on ongoing work to build power through the people and make a government that represents us and our communities. And thank you all for being a part of that work tonight on Election Day and beyond. Peace.
Thank you so much, Public Advocate Williams, our principal in this office. And if I may say so, he's doing a wonderful job helping to hold the folks we got to hold accountable. So again, thank you so much, Public Advocate Williams, for your remarks. And at this time, we'll introduce our two panelists. But before that, let me thank a couple of our team members. First of all, Jamela Rose, our Deputy Public Advocate for Civic Engagement, and of course, Farrain Griffin, our organizer in the same unit. Thank you too as well. Our panelists, I'll actually let them introduce themselves. First, we have from APA Voice Redistricting Task Force, Liz Ewing. Liz?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for including us. Special shout out to Farrain and Jamila for including APA Voice Redistricting Task Force. We are a group of 17 leading civil rights organizations in the city, and our goal is to ensure equal access to the redistricting process and to be sure that we are visible throughout the process as well.
Thank you. And I, of course, mispronounced your name. We just discussed it. so Liz Young, I apologize. And Jennifer Wilson from the League of Women Voters. Feel free to introduce yourself before we move on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much to the Public Advocates Office for including me. My name is Jennifer Wilson. I'm the Deputy Director for the League of Women Voters of New York State. And I'm very pleased to be with Liz today. We've worked together really closely on redistricting, so I think tonight is going to be a very lively discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I agree with that, because when you have a pro and a con, that's two different sides of an issue, right? So we'll get into it. So before we jump into it, I want to make sure that we summarize the five sort of points that we are to vote on when it comes to redistricting. And as a quick reminder, every 10 years, we engage in the census process, right? So that means counting the number of people in our state, and of course, in our case, the state of New York. And the purpose of that is really to ensure that each state gets the resources commensurate with the population, and that we have representation commensurate with the population. And what we saw this round are two things. One, we saw a delay in the census process for a couple of reasons, but primarily because of COVID-19. So what ended up happening was we, in fact, lost a congressional seat because of a alleged loss in population, although some debate whether we actually lost population. We can get into that later. So what we're talking about are district lines for the House of Representatives, the state Senate, and the state Assembly. That is subject to, if we go to the polls and we say, yes, we will adopt a plan from what's called the Independent Redistricting Commission that will change lines in a particular way and also adopt certain planks, which we'll summarize now. And we have a PowerPoint from New York Law, which helps summarize this. But here are the five key bullets, which we'll get into, and then we'll get to the panel. If approved, the amendment that we're going to vote on would, one, change the size of the state Senate to 63 firm seats. It would adjust census enumeration. It would require incarcerated people be counted at their last known address. It would shift the timeline for redistricting, and there's some nuance there, but we can get into it. And then it would change the nuances of the IRC, the Independent Commission, which we just addressed. And so we'll get into that a little bit more. But let's get to the first couple of questions. And they are number one, and I'll go to Liz, if you don't mind, for this first question. What is redistricting, and why should people even care?
Redistricting is a process that happens, as Nick said, every 10 years. After each decennial census, districts have to be redrawn to reflect the growth or the decrease in population. And so it's so important because it determines congressional lines, state Senate and state assembly lines, as Nick said. But why is it important? Because many people think if they just vote, they've done their civic duty, and that's power. But power in this country is defined in two ways. One, voting. The other, what district you're in that you are voting in, because it determines who votes in your district and also who will end up running in your district. For instance, you could vote 1,000 times, but you could never be able to elect a candidate of your choice because you're put in a district with people who don't have similar issues in common with you. And so you want to be in a district with people who are like-minded, who share similar concerns as you, and that you're not divided or splintered, and that those who share similar interests are kept together as large as possible so that you can have a voice. And that's why redistricting is important. We've seen close votes on the federal level when it dealt with the Affordable Care Act. A lot going on now with COVID-19. Congress can declare war, and Congress has auspices or jurisdiction over immigration and other issues. And then on a state level, the state deals with education, with criminal law in the state, and with budgets and money that different localities in the state get. So it's critical that people be aware of redistricting because it means power.
Thank you, Liz. That was a really great summary. And that actually is a really good segue to our second question, which is, how does the state of New York conduct the process? What has changed, and what is at stake?
Yeah, and I do apologize. I'm having some network connectivity issues. So if I black out, I will come back in on my phone.
Okay.
But yes, so how the process has changed since the last time we did redistricting in New York State, we actually passed another constitutional amendment, another ballot referendum back in 2014 that created this commission. So this is the first time we're having a commission-led redistricting process. Prior to this, it was our incumbent state Senate and state assembly drawing our district lines, which is not always the best thing because, of course, their main interest is to make sure that they can get reelected for the next 10 years. And so they draw the lines in a way that will help them get reelected. The idea of this commission is instead a commission would draw the lines and there would be less gerrymandering, less abuse of power in terms of manipulating lines and districts, and better representation overall. This commission is appointed by the legislature, so there is still a bit of influence in appointing these commissioners. There are 10 of them in total. The first 8 are appointed by the state Senate and assembly leaders of the majority and minority. And then the final 2 are appointed by the first 8, and they are meant to not be a member of either of the major parties so that there can be independent voices on the commission as well. The commission gets together and they draft maps, which they have done, and they must take into consideration the voices of the people by holding hearings throughout New York State at certain designated locations where people can comment on the maps, give their input, and make sure that these districts are being drawn fairly. And that process is actually happening right now. It's very exciting. The first hearing was today. Liz and APA Voice's redistricting task force have been extremely influential in this. But after we have commented on these maps, the commission will reconvene. And ultimately, what they will do is they will vote on the proposed maps. They'll make changes according to the comments of the people. Then they will vote as a 10-member commission. And the maps with the highest number of votes will go on to the legislature for the legislature to consider them. And the legislature can either take them up or vote them down. If they vote them down, they'll have a second opportunity to go ahead and introduce maps. And if they vote them up, then ultimately the governor will approve them and they'll be signed into law and we'll have maps. This amendment changes some of that process, the timing for the commission sending the maps over to the legislature, and the amount of votes needed for the commission to approve the maps, and then ultimately for the legislature to approve those maps as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was very informative. And, with some of these, boards and commissions, it's always a mystery as to, who are on these bodies. So I just Googled the commission and I'm just going to name them. So we have on the IRC, Ivelisse Cuevas Molina, Ross Brady, David Imamura, Jack Martins. I believe Jack was in the state Senate, Charles Nesbitt, Eugene Binger, George Winter, John Flateau, Elaine Frazier, and Keith Wolford. So those are the 10-member IRC commission at subject here. So before we go into the 5 prongs, we have a pro side this evening and a con side. And so I want to just hear top level, do you support or do you oppose? And then we'll go to the 5. So Jennifer, do you support or oppose?
We do oppose this amendment.
Got it. We'll get into why. So I assume, Liz, that means you support the amendment. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. All right, great. Let's get into why. All right. So why don't we do this? Why don't we go point by point and really get into the 5 bullets so that our listeners and viewers can really, get a flavor for what's going to be on the ballot. And if you want to pull up the PowerPoint, that's fine as well. So the first bullet is under proposal 1. A is the amendment would change the vote thresholds for adopting redistricting plans when one party controls both chambers. Let's start with your read on A, Jennifer, then we'll go to Liz. And actually, we may, I think she may be frozen. Let's see if Jennifer can hear us. Okay, Liz, if you want to start on that one, that's fine too. Then we'll come back to Jennifer.
No, let's wait to go to the next one, and then we'll go back to her on that one.
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
I want her to start on that one first.
That's fine. Cool.
Okay.
So B is the second B
Sorry,
is.
I think I'm back now.
No, it's okay. We can. Can you hear us now? Is it clear? Okay, cool. So we were just discussing
Yes.
what is the for A, quote, change the vote thresholds for adopting redistricting plans when one party controls both chambers.
Right. And so it's kind of funny we're starting with this one because this is the main reason why the league is opposed to this amendment. All of the other provisions in the amendment we are in favor of, but this particular one will change the threshold so that instead of requiring a 2/3 or super majority when the state Senate and Assembly is in control of both houses to approve the maps, this would switch it to either a simple majority if 7 of 10 members of the commission approve the maps, or a 60% majority if less than 7 of the 10 commissioners approve the maps. And the reason we're opposed to that is we are nonpartisan, and I realize this is not a nonpartisan commission, but part of why we were in favor of the original amendment was this idea that all parties have a voice, not just the Democrat and Republican Party, but also Green Party, Working Families Party, Conservative Party, all of the parties in New York State, and unaffiliated voters who don't necessarily fall within the party spectrum. And when we're thinking about this particular provision, this really gives all of the power to the majority party, which New York State is blue. It's always going to be blue. But in the United States in general, there's been a big split between the two major parties where not everyone is a central Democrat, not everyone is a central Republican. There's far right, there's far left, there's Democratic Socialists, there's Democratic Progressives, and we want them to have a voice too. And here in New York State, even though we have a supermajority of Democrats, we are seeing a lot more progressive candidates running for office, and we want them to have a fair shot when they are running for elected office. And if we're allowing the current, more centered Democrats in the Senate and Assembly to draft the lines exclusively without considering other voices, that might not happen in the future. And those progressive Democrats might not have a chance to get those seats. And so that is the main precipice of our opposition to this amendment. So the rest of the conversation should be pretty easy.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you, Jennifer. And let's go over to Liz on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, whoever is controlling either house, that there be one standard in place. There is many ways for the different factions to weigh in who the elected leaders appoint to the commission in order for there to be diversity. We see that on the current IRC right now. The Democratic appointees have, by and large, appointed very racially and gendered mixed appointees to the commission, and the minority party has appointed 5 white males to 4 white males, and then the 4 chose an independent person who happens to also be a white male. And so there are ways to, if they want to have that diversity reflected. But I think more than not, and it's not very clear that even, with the current configuration, particularly of the House, that this amendment would make, or the, previous standard would make a difference. I think more important is to get to the other 4 provisions, because taken as a whole, the other 4 provisions really carry the weight here.
That's a great segue. So the next one is counting incarcerated persons in their last known address. And, someone myself who's worked on justice policy, I see the rationale, but I'm curious to hear, both of your takes on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jennifer and I are like-minded on this
Mhm.
provision. Uh, Historically, um, jails have often been built in an area where people who are going to the jails don't live, and it has often they've often been built in suburban or upstate Republican districts, and the uh, district then got credit for the people who were living in that jail. They were counted towards the population of that district. And as a result, they got money because of the number of people that were in their district. And that is fundamentally unfair. Many people who live in prison don't come from those areas, and the very neighborhoods that need oftentimes more resources. So, there isn't a high rate of crime. Uh, uh, they should be counted where um, uh, they have lived. And it's important because even though there has been lawsuits about this very issue in our state, it needs to be in the Constitution, so that the very next day, bill isn't introduced to change that. You know what I mean? If it's enshrined and embedded in the New York Constitution.
So that would make it permanent law and not subject to the whims of the legislature. I understand that. Yep, Jennifer, on this one.
Yeah, I totally agree with Liz. The only other thing I would offer, as Liz points out, there was lawsuits on this. This is partially in state law for Senate and Assembly seats, not for congressional seats. So there is a little bit of protection in place. So the only thing we're really adding here, besides constitutionalizing, is making sure for congressional seats as well, we're counting people where they live.
Got it. Thank you. And for those watching, we are in fact monitoring our social media channels for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll try to grab a few of them. And we also want to thank one of our partners, Educated Voters. So thank you so much. All right, so let's look at the third plank in the proposed amendment under this question. And it is to require that the state count residents, including people who are not citizens, in the that is, if the federal count fails to do so. So this seems like a question of immigration status and being counted. So Liz or Jennifer, feel free to give your perspectives on that plank.
Sure. This was, if you people on this listening recall, very recently under the prior presidential administration, there were major lawsuits challenging how people were counted, and if undocumented persons should be counted, et cetera, et cetera. And so again, just like the provision of counting people who are in prison as if they were from their home neighborhoods, and enshrining it in the Constitution, it is as important to make sure that if the federal census does not report all people, documented or not, that we do in this state when we do redistricting, and very clear that all persons means those documented and undocumented.
Thank you. Yep, Jennifer.
Yeah, and we totally agree. The U.S. Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment does provide some of these protections, but not all of them. So this is important, but we do have partial protection at least.
Got it. Thank you. So that's the first three questions under this proposal, and there are two. Actually, there are three more. Now, this one, sometimes when we get to voting on stuff, they have these political terms or technical terms that may confuse folks. I'm glad we're having this conversation. But this next question is, it would remove the quote block on border requirement for Senate districts. It would remove the block on border requirement for state Senate districts. Who wants to define what that is and then give your perspective on that one?
Jennifer, you want to go?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. And this is such a funny, well, it's not funny, it's just a very complicated, complex sort of issue. But essentially, block on border allows the splitting of blocks when you're redistricting and you want your populations to be basically equal as possible. We allow block on border to split a block, even though it's not always advantageous to do so when it's in the mindset of we must have one person, one vote, equal representation. I've heard this argued as both a pro and a con to remove it. The Assembly does not have block on border, so we're bringing the Senate in line with the Assembly. I've heard it called an anti-gerrymandering provision, but I also think it's important to keep blocks together. So I've heard it argued both ways. It's definitely one of those things that is very wonky and hard to describe.
Yeah, and I would just ditto what Jennifer said. It's very complicated, very legalese, laden with legalese.
That's right. That's right. I mean, even the way you described it, like, oh, splitting up individual blocks. And then if you think about communities of interest, you know, you can ask yourself, well, does a block have the same interests? I assume so, but what if they, you know, so I get the debate there. Okay. So we have two other ones, and then we'll see if there are questions. The next one here, it would cap the number of state senators at 63.
Okay. And we support that because unfortunately, in history has shown that time and time again, you know, 3 or 4 times in our history where when Republicans were in control, they increased the number of Senate seats. And those numbers went in areas where there was a strong Republican stronghold, thereby weakening the other seats in more Democratic House districts. And so to prevent that from happening, to cap it at 63, which is the current number, would prevent that from happening.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd offer is the Assembly is currently capped at 150 and 63 is the current number of senators. I think the Constitution actually says 58 in there. But as Liz pointed out, the number was raised up. It kind of is a erroneous number, like it's not related to the number of counties. You could argue that it's helpful to have that number not be frozen because it could allow, since as Nick, you pointed out earlier, even though we lost a seat, our population in New York State did grow. So it could be helpful to add a legislator in districts where we do have more people. But again, I'm playing devil's advocate with myself. The Assembly is frozen at 150, so it makes sense to freeze the Senate too.
That's interesting. So let's say in 10 years, the population, and I assume it will, particularly in New York City, or actually maybe elsewhere as well, continues to grow. Do you think that, and that would mean in those Senate and Assembly districts, the, I guess, lines may change, but there are more people packed. I shouldn't use the word packed, that's a legal term, but, you know, put in a certain district. So, like, what are your thoughts on, you know, assuming the population continues to grow, but we've, as a matter of the Constitution, said no more than 63 in the Senate, and I think you said 158. Is that what you said in the Assembly?
150.
150 in the Assembly. Thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Liz has thoughts on this too, but I think it's one of those things where it depends who you ask. If we have a truly fair process of redistricting, I do think it can be advantageous to allow for an increase of seats. Certainly now with our congressional districts, they're going to be huge now, much bigger than they've ever been. And to the point where it's almost like, is this even fair representation? We have so many people in these congressional districts because not only did our population grow, we lost a seat, so they're going to be bigger than ever. So you could argue if the population continues to increase in New York State, it can be helpful to allow the number of senators to grow. But again, as Liz pointed out, this has been used as a gerrymandering tactic in the past, so it's not always good.
Understood. Okay. Any additions there, Liz? And if not, we'll go to the final of the 6 questions here.
No, I concur with what Jennifer said.
Got it. Okay. So number 6, the amendment, if approved on election day, would move up the timeline for redistricting and repeal, this is technical, repeal inoperative language. And I believe part of the reason for that is the COVID-19 pandemic, where apparently some things were delayed. Is that accurate? And then what are both of your reads on the timeline? And what will be the new timeline?
Yeah, that's accurate. For this year, because everything was delayed because of the census, initially, the IRC was supposed to submit its final maps, by January 15th because of 2022, because of the delays that have been caused by COVID-19 and census data being released that the redistricting commission needed in order to come up with maps. And the amendment basically, moves that date up for this year, for this 2020 redistricting cycle, to January 1st. And then 10 years from now, when 2030 redistricting happens, it moves up the date for submitting their plan to the legislature for sometime in November. And the reason for that shift is just practical, because now we have primaries in June instead of September. And so, it will give the legislature time to approve a plan and have lines up and running. And so candidates who will be running will know, what is their district. And so it's really a very practical measure in place.
Understood. So those are the 6, and just we'll check to see if there are audience questions momentarily. But I want to reference very briefly, New York Law School did a PowerPoint. I don't know if we have it. If we do, cool. Otherwise, I can just kind of read a piece of their presentation, which regards or just says other provisions in the amendment. And it says it would authorize the legislature to enact redistricting plans or legislation, excuse me, if the IRC, the commission, fails to complete action and develop plans. So for the people watching, they may assume that the IRC is the sort of end all be all, but apparently it's not. Apparently there's the possibility of inaction. So is that accurate? And then what's your take on that provision?
We're living it right now, Nick. Unfortunately, the Independent Redistricting Commission, they couldn't agree, the 10 of them, on their first set of maps that they released. And so they released 2 very different maps. And so that forebodes, unfortunately, what the future may be. And quite possibly a scenario where they can't agree on a set of maps going to the legislature. And so then in that situation, the legislature needs to kick in. We don't have a truly independent commission, because it is a commission where, although there's no elected leaders on the Independent Redistricting Commission, they're appointed by elected leaders. And so until we truly have an Independent Redistricting Commission, there's always going to be a heavy-handed role for the state legislature here.
Got it. Jennifer, any notes there?
Yeah, I mean, the current amendment doesn't specify what happens if the current, I shouldn't say the current amendment because then people think we're talking about this one, but the current structure of the commission doesn't specify what happens if they fail. It's sort of ambiguous. And I've heard people say, oh, well, it'll definitely go to the legislature even without this provision. I've also heard people say, oh, no, it'll go to the court. And then I heard from probably the most reliable source, well, it'll go to the court and then they'll give it to the legislature to do. Court-drawn districts, our congressional districts, our current ones were drawn by a court, tend to actually be pretty good. We, in comparison to other states in the nation, have pretty good congressional districts. They're not always good, but in our case, they are. And so this will say that the legislature can take over. And it is worrisome because it's almost as if a disincentivization for the commission to work together, knowing that ultimately the legislature may take over the process anyway, which definitely is not the ideal type of structure for a redistricting commission, but it's the one that we got.
Got you. Thank you. All right. So here's the next order of business. I think we're right on time here. We will go to some audience questions. So once again, for those watching, if you have questions, drop them in the chat sections now. And then after we address whatever questions that come in, we will go to closing statements from our two panelists, and they will thank our team members and adjourn for the evening. So the first audience question is, quote, the ballot states that, the ballot states, quote, delete certain provisions that violate the U.S. Constitution. Can you explain this? Jennifer, you can take this one if you would like.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. So in our current constitution, we have a lot of dead language, and the language refers to aliens, which is not a term we use anymore, should not be using. And so all of that language violates what I spoke about earlier, the Equal Protection Clause, because we should not be using that language. It should not be in there. So it will remove all of that dead language. It's been in there a long time. It's very odd they didn't take it out when they did the 2014 amendment, but they left it in for whatever reason. They've ignored it the last round of redistricting. Proposal would take it out altogether, or clean it up a little.
Got it. Yeah, it's a little jarring to see language that says delete provisions that violate the U.S. Constitution. Like, okay. Okay, cool. I don't see any other audience questions now. So if any others come in, we'll tackle one or two of them. But at this time, let's go to closing statements. So what does the voter watching this panel or heading to the booth need to know? What's missing in terms of, what's coming up on election day? And anyone can just take that or any other remarks you would like to make, including your contact information, if you like.
Okay. Well, I would just say that it is important what's on the ballot coming up, not only for civic engagement reasons, other things that are on the ballot that you guys covered on Monday, but for redistricting, because as Nick said, this happens every 10 years. So what lines are adopted are in effect for 10 years. So it's really, really important that I hope that you will vote in favor of the Amendment 1, because on balance, the overwhelming number of provisions, are not in dispute, and they really would go a long way to protect marginalized groups like immigrants and prisoners, and it takes away certain practices that in the past have been used to gerrymander, like raising the number of seats in the Senate, and this ballot referendum puts an end to that, and so on balance, overall, the Amendment 1 really is a inclusive and very democratic amendment.
Got it. And Jennifer, your closing statement. And I know, of course, based on the first question, the league is opposed. So feel free to lay out your position once again.
Yeah, and Liz is definitely right. There's a lot of positive things in there. And if this doesn't pass, ultimately they can pass in future years. And to the point of this idea of New York State is a blue state, I know some people who are Democrats are going to vote in favor of this because they feel like, oh, in red states we need to combat the takeover, the gerrymandering being done by the other side. And if that's your position, that's totally fair. Like, I'm not going to fight you on that. But from our standpoint, I think a blaring example of this idea of more progressive Democrats and more sort of center Democrats is the Single Payer Universal Healthcare Act here in New York State. We've had complete Democratic control since 2019, and that provision has been unable to pass, even with total Democratic control. So I think that if we're going to allow this single party that to just completely control the process, it's not going to be a good outcome overall for us.
Thank you both. And actually, I apologize. We did get an additional audience question, and then I'll come back and close. So the second audience question is, are there other states that use similar IRC processes? And I assume that means the structure by allowing this independent body to develop lines, run them to the legislature, to the people, and I guess back around. So are you aware of other states and what are the distinctions, if any?
Well, they range the different types of redistricting processes. Some like New York's, others much more independent, where it's truly independent, and or certain jurisdictions, and not appointed by political parties even. And so there's a range of different kinds, but particularly, how many states, I'm going to ask Jennifer to weigh in.
I don't know the number of states off the top of my head, but the National Council of State Legislatures keeps all that data. So if you're interested in other commission states, check out their website.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So I think this has been what I hope is an informative just about an hour in regards to this proposal. We've heard a pro argument from Liz and a con argument from Jennifer at the League. And the purpose here is to make sure that our voters are informed. We aren't, as an office, recommending at this point, one or the other. That's for you to decide. Our function here is to make sure that people have the information needed. And in that light, you can feel free to check out our website at advocate.nyc.gov. Or if you need more information, you can visit us on Twitter at NYCPA, and the same title on Instagram and Facebook. Or you can also email us at gethelp@advocate.nyc.gov, or you can call 212-669-7250. Once again, 212-669-7250. Oh, there's y'all want to take that last one? There's one more that came in from audience members. Should we take that one? I'll ask it and see if we can tackle it. One final question before we hop off. How would redistricting affect Co-op City Bronx? Okay. Pro and con.
Jennifer, you want to handle that one?
I'm not sure if Jennifer can hear us. Can you hear us, Jennifer?
Yeah. We in APA Voice, our membership, Caribbean Equality Project has some base in the Bronx, but not significant. So I don't feel qualified to answer this one. Jennifer, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have an answer for this one either, unfortunately. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. What we'll do is we'll take it back in the office, and whoever asked the question, feel free to contact us in those ways I just just mentioned, and we'll get back to you and look at how it would affect. I see Co-op City in particular, and I get it. All right, so it's been a great hour. Thank you all for tuning in. Again, if you have any questions about the process, feel free to get in touch with us. And thank you all. Thank you, Jennifer, Liz. Thank you to our interpreters. It's been a great hour. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you.
Jennifer. Bye.